Hi everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Contact Research Now. I am Emine Bilgen, a lecturer in social psychology at Bursa Technical University in Turkey.
And I'm Lucas Walrich, a lecturer in organizational psychology at Birkbeck Business School in London. Together, we explore the latest research on intergroup contact. Today, we're tackling a key debate, the effects of positive versus negative contact. While positive contact has long been understood to improve intergroup relations, over the past decade, concerns about negative contact have emerged.
Today, we are joined by four researchers, Stefania, Sarina, Giulia, and Jasper, who recently examined how contact variance relates to prejudice, language, and social norms. We will discuss negativity bias, the role of self-selection, and why people perceive the same interaction differently. Plus, we consider whether the risk of negative contact outweighs the benefits of positive interactions, and what that means for real-world interventions.
Let's dive in.
Our first guest is Dr. Stefania Paolini. Stefania is a professor of social and intercultural psychology at Durham University in the UK. Her research focuses on diversity, social cohesion, prejudice, stereotyping, intergroup contact, and ways to promote inclusion. Today, Stefania will present findings from her recent meta-analysis on negativity bias in intergroup contact, published in Psychological Bulletin. Together with her co-authors, she examines how negative intergroup contact has a stronger impact on prejudice than positive contact, especially when people have the motivation and opportunity to opt out of contact. Welcome, Stefania. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Amin. Thanks for having me.
Stefania, you recently published meta-analysis on the relationship between intergroup contact and outgroup prejudice. What inspired you to study this topic?
This publication really is a little bit of the last progression on a longer line of work that I started around 15 years ago, starting with the prospective work on the impact of negative intergroup contact on a variety of psychological processes that are relevant to intergroup contact dynamics. And is a kind of reflects an evolution of thinking over this period of time. It's been a long journey. There was an official call for research on negative intergroup contact made by Pettigrew and Trop in their very influential meta-analysis in the early 2000s. The reality is that we were quite unprepared from a conceptual and a measurement perspective to tackle the challenge. Plus, there was a very subtle implicit resistance within the community to actually go and delve in those dark areas of our processes, primarily because our research tradition has been heavily influenced by a strong emphasis on supporting the understanding of processes of contact-based intervention. So the application of intergroup contact to contexts in which there is segregation, marginalization, etc. So we've been used to think at intergroup contact as a tool to address this problem in society, and this has caused us to really pay a kind of large interest in positive contact rather than the darker form of this intergroup interaction. There was a kind of orthodoxy resistance to really delve and get our hands dirty. This recent meta-analysis for me is a culmination of this journey of discovery, and also a little bit of going against the grain of this orthodoxy. I'm glad I made this journey because I think it has overall contributed to make us more sophisticated and more complex thinkers, and to give us more refined tools to inform policy and intervention in this space.
If there is one key finding you would want our audience to remember, what would it be?
I would say it's probably two-sided to the key findings that are really reported in the meta-analysis. The meta-analysis displays the existence of a negativity bias in intergroup contact effects. So what we discover is that in line with other areas of psychology, where negativity biases have been extensively documented and demonstrated, we demonstrated that also within intergroup contact dynamics, negative can be stronger than positive. So across the studies, the degree of association between contact and outgroup prejudice is in absolute terms larger in size when contact is negative compared to when contact is positive. And this means that under condition in which the quality of contact can vary in valence, contact can potentially lead more readily to a negative spiraling of intergroup relationship compared to a positive spiraling of relationship because of the greater impact on group level judgment and processes. However, this does not predict at all the original finding from Pettigrew and Trop's meta-analysis that positive contact has significant benefits for intergroup relationship. That is also captured by our revised meta-analysis. It's just that the impact of negative contact is typically larger than the impact of positive contact. However, this effect obviously needs to be put in the context of a different type of valence asymmetry we discovered in recent years, which has to do with the differential prevalences of positive and negative contact. Luckily, there is now extensive evidence from across a variety of research laboratories around the world, and also a variety of sample population and context, showing that positive contact is significantly more prevalent than negative contact in most contexts, including those of post-conflict society. So this means that, in theory, the greater impact of negative contact can be muted or diluted by the greater prevalence of positive contact. For me, the coexistence of these two types of valence asymmetry are very important, and they need to be kept in consideration together to have a fuller picture of how contact valence might play out in real naturalistic settings. The other finding that I think is very interesting from the meta-analysis is about the moderation of this basic negativity bias by self-selection processes. What we demonstrate in this synthesis is that the negativity biases are more pronounced, are more likely to materialize strong under condition in which individuals are free to opt in and out of contact experiences. There is a greater opportunity for self-selection. The negativity biases are more pronounced under condition in which people are likely to be motivated to want to opt out of contact. So what does this mean is that under condition there is greater opportunity and motivation to exert contact volition, negativity biases are more likely to occur. This is likely because these people, or many people in this context, would take up those opportunities to opt out. And we know that the people who are likely to do that are those who are more likely to have negative attitude towards the out-group, to have negative expectation about intergroup contact with those groups in society. And therefore, people who are likely to not endure or persist in interacting with out-group members, and therefore, according to certain models of impression formation, likely to remove themselves from interaction context with the outgroup, and therefore retain a kind of primitive, simplistic perception of these groups, which are the ideal basis for stereotyping and stigmatization. From a practical perspective, these moderating findings for self-selection processes basically are just a warning for practitioners and policymakers, and for us scholars, to recognize that certain contexts, especially the unstructured one, the informal settings that allow for greater self-selection processes, those are the more dangerous for the escalation of negative dynamics between groups in society. We need to be particularly mindful to try to curate these experiences for individuals and groups to ensure that those settings don't become the context for negative spiraling of intergroup relationships.
Thank you. Actually, my next question is about your next steps. What comes next for you? Are you already working on any follow-up studies?
Yes, I am. I continue to be interested in contact valence across settings that are structured and unstructured. In particular, I'm working at the moment on another meta-analytical project that was actually started at the same time as the psychological bulletin meta-analysis. I haven't had a chance to write it up, and it's my charge for the next few months. This is a meta-analysis of positive valence asymmetry in prevalence that I was referring to before. So we have collated a data set that operationalized contact valence in a within subject way rather than a between subject way with the focus of the psychological bulletin paper. It is richer. More recent studies have got into the habit of incorporating measures of both positive and negative contact in the protocol. And with this work, we want to just establish meta-analytically the existence of that positivity valence asymmetry in prevalence, which has been demonstrated by a narrative review by Schäfer et al. In 2021. We want to do a more systematic synthesis of the work, but also we want to see what are the contextual conditions that strengthen that positivity valence asymmetry, because that will give us some indication of policy and intervention strategies to increase the chances that positive contact will outnumber strongly and robustly negative contact in society. So yes, more work in this field, and still very excited about this topic. As integral contact scholars, we got lots to offer to practitioners and policymakers who want to make this world a better world, a more harmonious world, but also a more justice world in terms of intergroup relationship.
Thank you, Stefania. This was a really interesting interview.
Next, we will speak with Dr. Sarina Schäfer, whose recent research made us think again about what we actually mean by positive and negative contact, and whether the measurements used so far fully capture what matters. Sarina is a lecturer in the Department for Psychological Methods and Evaluation at the Fernuniversität in Hagen, Germany. The research focuses on the quality of intergroup contact and its relationship with a variety of outcomes, including health. She's also very interested in novel methods, such as virtual reality, as well as methodological challenges. Today, we will speak about a recent paper she co-authored on the importance of distinguishing the intensity of contact experiences from their valence, published in Group Processes and Intergroup Relations. Welcome, Sarina. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Sarina, there have been many studies of positive and negative contact. What inspired you to add to that pool?
Well, first of all, I think I have to disagree because while there are quite a number of studies on positive contact and on negative contact too, especially if you include things like threat or discrimination as being part or some kind of negative contact, there still is a lot we don't know. And especially if you think about the interplay of positive and negative contact. And as we also argue in the paper, if you think about how positive and negative contact occur in the real world, there are many exciting open research questions in that field. And the question of intensity is just one of them. While inspiration is really important in our field of research, it also has to be highlighted that it was a job. I applied for a research project examining positive and negative intergroup contact. While I'm interested in a wide range of social psychological questions, that ended up to be my focus because that actually was where the money came from.
Makes sense. So how did you approach that research project?
I'm a peace and conflict researcher from my training, but I'm also working at a department of psychological methods. So my mind is always thinking about how can we design a setup so that we can actually consider causal inferences. What we did here is we ran 3 experiments and added survey data to get more of a impression how these highly controlled settings from the lab would play out in the wild. To do so, I built on research from other people. And I want to highlight Ben Feld's work, who did a dissertation on positive and negative contact and was involved with the project as well. And he adapted a experimental paradigm, a feedback task, to the field of intergroup contact in his thesis. And so we used this indirect collaboration task and adapted it for online environments to actually not only manipulate positive and negative experiences, but also intensity of experiences.
So how did you do that? How did you manipulate intensity?
What the indirect collaboration task does is you bring people together. There's one confederate, a person you train, and then there's the participants coming in. For us, it would be one participant each, introduced as being two participants. In our case, we chose the intergroup contact setting of different universities, like a more research-oriented or a more applied university or a distance learning or traditional university. After a few introductory tasks, the participants would have to deliver on some tasks and they would receive fake feedback on these tasks. The feedback would be on scales, and that makes it very nice from an experimental standpoint because you can objectively manipulate the negativity or the positivity of the respective feedback.
Yeah. Okay. And what would you say was one key finding you'd want our audience to remember?
That is quite a challenge, but to be transparent, we knew the questions beforehand, so I had some time to think about it. I think from a research standpoint, the most important takeaway is to be, in theory and in empirical research, be very clear about what are you talking about if you're talking about intergroup contact. As our research demonstrates, it makes a difference whether people are talking about friendship, highly positive interactions, mildly positive greetings, or even if you think about negative contact, being ignored or being yelled at. So be very clear, what are you talking about? What are you thinking about? And which aspect do you actually want to manipulate if you're thinking about interventions? So that was the theoretical point. And then from a more practical stand, I think the most important takeaway is to be kind, be friendly to your neighbors while waiting at the bus stop in your everyday interactions. Being friendly can make a difference.
Okay. And obviously there's much more, but we do want people to read the papers. So thank you. Was there anything you learned from conducting the research? Anything that was surprising to you?
Well, I think the most important learning for myself from that paper was that objective quality not necessarily translate to subjective quality. And I believe this is a fact that we have largely ignored in intergroup contact research, that perceived contact quality is something very subjective. And there is a large variance in the perception of an interaction as being positive or negative. I think that is actually one of the most exciting insights from that research, that even if you manage to manipulate contact on very objective measures, this might not be what ends up in the individual's perception, and what ends up there might be very different for different people.
Which makes measurement really quite difficult. So
quite a nice challenge.
Yes. Yes. In the paper, you yet again find an asymmetry between positive and negative contact, this time for the intensity of contact. How do you explain that asymmetry?
Well, in the paper, and now that's the part where I'd say read the paper if you're actually interested in it, because we refer to several very general psychological explanations about why we find differences in negativity and positivity. For example, the review by Rosa and Reisman from 2001 highlights that negative effects might approach much faster, might have a much earlier onset than positive effects. And that is what we argue in the paper. I still believe, although there's a caveat, and I'll get back to that it actually needs a rather high positivity for people to recognize something as especially positive. Luckily, in our lives, we are living in slightly positive environments. Our everyday lives are structured so that we experience more positive than negative experiences. So you might need a bit more of positivity for positivity's effect to actually kick in. And now then there's the caveat, because even in our survey data set in Great Britain between Asian British and non-Asian British people, we don't find people reporting high negativity. So in the whole study, we are missing events of high negativity. From an ethical standpoint, we can't do experiments where we torture participants. Terrorist attacks or violence might be a part of some intergroup relations. Some individuals might experience events of high negativity, and our results won't tell you anything about these effects.
Makes sense. Thank you. You already talked about one practical implication, the need to be kind. But I was wondering if your finding is that people are quite sensitive to even low intensity negative contact, if that makes contact interventions more risky, if we can't control valence fully. How are you thinking about that?
I wouldn't say make it more risky, because in most intergroup settings, negative contact is super rare, just like it is in our everyday lives with in-group contact. So, and then on the other hand, negative contact is super normal. You will experience negative experiences with your in-group members too. I believe the way to go forward is not necessarily to think about how can we get rid of all negative experiences between groups, but to have a better look at why do those negative experiences influence our prejudice about a group to a much larger degree for the out-group than for the in-group.
It's already a really interesting research question. So I was wondering what comes next to you. Are you already working on any follow-up you would like to share?
The whole expectation perspective and the insights we got about differences in perceived contact quality is accompanying me in my ongoing research, but I want to highlight another project together with my amazing PhD student, Jill Ullenboom. We call it Disentangling Intergroup Contact, and we will examine how distinct intergroup interactions of positive and negative valence add up over time to form like what we call like an individual's representation of intergroup contact overall. And we'll be using some very nice paradigms we developed where we will study interactions with an alien species, but also with real groups in video games. And we'll complement that with diary studies over different timescales to kind of get at the core of what are we measuring and what are we talking about. If we're talking about overall contact, how do individual experiences of positive and negative interactions play into that?
Very interesting. I look forward to those results. Thank you very much, Sarina.
Thank you for having me.
Our next guest has explored the relationship between negative contact and a very intriguing outcome, the very language we use to talk about outgroups. Dr. Giulia Rosa Policardo is a postdoc and adjunct professor in social psychology at the University of Florence. Her research interests include contact between minorities, body image anxiety, and the translation of measurement scales. Today, we will discuss a paper she co-authored in the Journal of Language and Social Psychology, where they looked at the relationship between contact experiences and the very language people use when talking about outgroups. Welcome, Giulia. Thank you for joining us. So there have been many studies of intergroup contact, but not that many that focused on language use as an outcome. What inspired you to look at language?
Many studies, most of studies, focus on how intergroup interaction can reduce negative prejudice, but few studies have explored something that are more subtle, but just important, linguistic intergroup bias. This is when people use a different type of language to describe in-group and out-group member positive and negative actions. We saw this is a gap in the research, and since language can reinforce or challenge discriminatory ideas, we wanted to see how intergroup contact might impact this form of bias.
I was surprised to see you didn't just look at the valence of language, but you looked at the abstraction. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, linguistic abstraction offer crucial insight into the cognitive structure that shape intergroup attitude. The valence refers to a specific behavior, positive or negative connotation. Abstraction indicate the perceived stability and generalizability. For instance, describing a group member behavior with an abstract term like they are dishonest imply the presence of a stable trait, individual characteristic could be attributed to the individual or the entire group. In contrast, using more concrete description, such as they lied about this particular issue, frames the behavior as a situational occasion, making it less likely to be generalized. The relevance of linguistic abstraction lies in its connection to stereotypes, which are inherently abstract and generalized forms of information about a person or group. This abstraction makes it more difficult to challenge or modify stereotypes, as generalized representation tend to be more persistent than situational ones. By focusing on linguistic abstraction, we can identify implicit mechanism of bias that traditional direct measure of attitude often overlook. This approach offers new insight into how discrimination is maintained and highlight potential new direction for dismantle this generalized idea.
So how did you go about studying that? What methods did you use?
To investigate the relationship between frequency and valence of intergroup contact and the linguistic outgroup bias, we analyzed the positive and negative linguistic abstraction scores of how the white British majority group described their interaction with the member of British Asian minority group. Our approach was driven by the well-known linguistic category model, a framework that proposed by Semin and Fiedler, which classify language used in the interpersonal setting, interpersonal interaction, into 4 categories, each reflecting a different degree of abstractions. This category, ordered from the least to most abstract, are descriptive action verbs. For example, person A push person B, interpretative action verbs, for example, person A hurts person B, and state verb, person A ate person B. And finally, adjectives, person A is aggressive. These varying level of abstraction have distinctive cognitive outcome implication. Specifically, abstract language tend to convey a stable trait-like qualities, while concrete language highlight situational specificity. This means us to explore how abstract language may contribute to the maintenance of negative vision of that specific minority group. Notably, people do not usually exercise conscious control over the level of linguistic abstraction they use, making it a subtle but powerful indicator of intergroup bias.
What would you say is a key finding that you would want people to remember from your research?
A single key takeaway with like your audience to remember is that positive intergroup contact, whether direct or extended, can serve as a protective buffer against the detrimental effect of negative contact on linguistic discrimination, while negative interaction often have a stronger immediate impact, fostering frequent and meaningful positive interaction can significantly reduce the tendency of use abstract and biased language when describe outgroup member.
Very interesting. So how do you explain that buffering effect?
We found that both direct and extended positive contact with a British Asian individual weakened the association between a direct negative intergroup contact and the use of a negative linguistic abstraction description. These findings suggest that positive contact play a subtle and innovative crucial role rather than being directly and inversely related to the prejudice. The frequency of positive experiences with British Asian individuals appears to act as a protective factor. It mitigates the impact of a negative intergroup contact on linguistic discrimination. Overall, our finding underscored the importance of examining separately positive and negative experiences and their interaction.
And when you think back to the research project, what did you personally learn from it? Was there anything that surprised you?
Probably the major surprise is that the major of the studies about intergroup contact sustain that positive experience directly reduce prejudice. But in our case, positive experience doesn't have this association, but have a buffer and mitigate impact. This is the surprise result.
Okay. And what comes next for you? Are you already working on any follow-ups?
At the moment, we don't have any specific follow-up studies, but we have, as a highlight in our paper, in the final part of the paper, we found that negative intergroup experience are more strongly associated with how people depict and communicate about outgroup member compared to positive contact. That said, the current distinction between positive and negative contact is quite broad, encompassing a range of human experiences that vary in intensity and intimacy. A promising direction for future research would be to analyze the specific topics discussed during this exchange. We could assess how the nature of the interaction shapes linguistic outgroup discrimination. This approach probably would offer deeper insight into how different conversational topics influence the balance of contact experience and in turn affect intergroup attitude. Understanding these dynamics could provide a clear and complete path toward reducing social discrimination.
Thank you very much. I hope you will get a chance to conduct that research or for someone else to pick up on your start. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much.
Our final guest is Dr. Jasper van Assche, who has explored how indirect contact shapes intergroup attitudes, especially among individuals with authoritarian tendencies. Jasper is a professor at the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology at the University of Brussels in Belgium. Jasper's research focuses on topics like political attitudes, intergroup relations, and prejudice. Today, we will discuss a recent study he co-authored, where he and his colleagues examined the relationships between positive and negative extended intergroup contact and attitudes towards immigrants. Specifically, he will focus on how these dynamics interact with authoritarianism. Welcome, Jasper. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, what inspired you to study this topic?
I think the inspiration was twofold. Maybe first of all, I didn't do this study alone. I had Klaas Polmans with me from the University of Chemnitz, and he originally planned a research day at my previous university, Ghent University in Belgium, and we were planning to work together to test the idea of how norms within social groups can impact authoritarian tendencies to express more or less prejudice in some situations. Unfortunately, COVID hit and he had to stop his internship with us, his research stay. So that was a bad coincidence. At the same time, we did have some data on intergroup contact, on extended intergroup contact, and we wanted to use that as an indication of norms. The second reason why we explored this idea is because we both already worked during our PhD on the role of authoritarianism in our ideas and behavior. And at the same time, in the lab where I used to work, there was a lot of data being gathered on intergroup contact, both direct forms, but also indirect forms. For a society where sometimes direct contact is impossible or very difficult, it may be worthwhile to look into the dynamics of extended contact. And that's why we came up with this idea to see, does extended contact in its positive and negative forms work equally well for everybody?
Could you now walk us through how you approach studying this topic? Like, what kind of methods did you use?
Yeah, first of all, we looked at the data sets that we already collected, and those data sets were secondary. Some of them didn't have the idea behind it to test this specific hypothesis, but they were useful anyway. So we gathered our data, we looked at which type of contact, direct, indirect, positive, negative, was measured, if there was a scale of authoritarianism, and ideally if there were the subdimensions as well that were represented. That wasn't always the case. In almost all of the cases, there was some intergroup attitude at the end that we could use as a dependent variable. And so we did the analysis in two ways. First, in each independent sample, we ran regressions to see if we control for demographic variables, direct contact experiences, what is the role of negative and positive indirect contact? Does negative or positive extended contact have the same effect on people low versus high on RWA? We collapsed all of these data into an internal meta-analysis of all these independent samples. And that gave us like a larger look on, is there an interaction, yes or no, and how can we interpret this?
If there is one key finding you would want our audience to remember, what would it be?
The term that we came up with, or that we tried to coin, is extended contact asymmetry, indicating that extended contact doesn't have the same effect for everyone. And the idea is that positive contact or extended contact has larger effects on people high in authoritarianism, whereas negative extended intergroup contact has similar effects for people both high and low in authority. So that's, I think, the key finding that you should take home with.
Thank you. What did you learn from conducting this research? Did anything surprise you along the way?
Yeah, so what has been done before was the interaction of individual differences such as authoritarianism in combination with direct forms of contact, and also one study with positive indirect forms of contact. And each time the tendency was that contact works equally well or even better for example, people high in RWA. But that has never been done with a negative contact or negative indirect contact specifically. Our idea was to test this as well and to see if, for instance, if positive contact has larger effects on authoritarians, if also this is the case for negative contact, because the idea was that with this extended contact, there are norms to be created. And if all of your peers have positive experiences, maybe this dampens your individual tendency to exert prejudices. But at the same time, if all of your peers report to you that they have negative experiences with outgroup members, our idea was that maybe, especially for authoritarians who are keen to follow the norms, they would also react with more prejudice. And that was not the case. That was to us surprising. In the discussion, we elaborate on how this could be the case, because past literature also showed this negativity bias. Bad is stronger than good, but here it doesn't seem to be the case, especially with negative indirect contact.
Okay. You just mentioned negativity bias, and my next question is actually related to that. So
Yeah.
we know that negative extended contact is often found to increase prejudice more often than positive contact reduces it. Do you think your results challenge that?
I think we should be careful with this interpretation, because we never had the idea to compare the strength of the association of positive and negative extended contact. We did, however, put them in the same regression. What we find is that there is no difference in the effect size, statistically speaking, between the role of positive and negative contact. The role of positive and negative direct contact is almost equally the same, albeit in opposite directions, of course. And same for extended contact. The effect size of positive extended contact is almost the same as its opposite for negative extended contact. We do not find evidence for the contact caveat. Here, the preliminary evidence seems to suggest that one does not work stronger than the other. And the positive one, that there the advantage is that actually it can take with authoritarians towards more tolerance, because there it buffers the association between RWA and prejudice, for example.
You also mentioned that authoritarianism, they are sensitive to societal norms and conformity. But your study didn't find a link between negative extended contact and authoritarianism. How do you explain this?
Yeah, we struggle with it. And I don't even use the past tense. Klaas and I still meet on a regular basis to think about follow-up studies on how to interpret this. One big limitation of this study is that we did not directly measure norms. Our idea was that when people report that others in their social network have positive experiences, it is a sign of positive norms being created in these networks. This may probably be the case, and therefore we can expect that interaction effect with authoritarianism, because they are keen to follow norms, for example, or to obey the rules and regulations or the norms and customs within their group. On the other hand, we don't know exactly what happens when people report negative extended contact. We think that it indicates that there are negative norms or norms towards outgroup avoidance that are being created in these networks or peer groups, but we didn't directly measure that. One of our ideas for the future is to look into the school context where classmates are together in the same bubble and where you can measure the actual experiences and norms within these classes, within these peer groups, to see if we can find the same interactions or lack of interactions with RWA, because that would be even stronger evidence for this asymmetry that we find. So what happens exactly in terms of norm setting when people think or elaborate about negative experiences or intergroup experiences of their peers, we're not sure yet. And I think that's certainly an avenue for future research to develop.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your research.
With pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. A huge thank you to our guests, Stefania, Sarina, Giulia, and Jasper, for sharing their fascinating insights and contributing to such engaging discussions.
But we're not stopping there. We'll be back excited to explore other research areas with members of the International Contact Research Network over the coming month. In upcoming episodes, we'll discuss topics like the use of virtual reality and other technology in contact, how contact unfolds over time, and intergroup contact in children and adolescents.
For now, we would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts on the podcast or ideas for future episodes. Check the show notes for our emails. Also, please share the podcast with friends and colleagues who might find it interesting.
Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again next time.